Mark Ellison scrubbed hallways where his daughter walked, 7 years of bleach-stained hands and swallowed words, watching Lily Hart grow into someone else's perfect life, while his DNA test sat folded in his wallet like a prayer he couldn't say aloud. The billionaire father never came to her rehearsals. Mark came to every single one, invisible behind cleaning carts and half-closed doors. On the night of the play, security pushed him toward the exit because janitors don't belong in family seating. Then Lily saw him leaving. Her scream shattered the auditorium. "Daddy!" Subscribe to witness the moment truth refused to stay buried. Mark Ellison's hands smelled like industrial lemon cleaner and something deeper, something that never quite washed away, no matter how many times he scrubbed them raw under the faculty restroom sink. At 42, his knuckles had started to remember every floor he'd ever mopped, every urinal he'd ever scraped, every baseboard he'd ever wiped down on his knees, while parents in expensive shoes stepped around him like he was part of the architecture. Dayton Elementary School's hallways stretched long and bright under fluorescent lights that hummed a constant reminder of his place in the hierarchy of visibility. He pushed his yellow bucket on wheels, the mop handle worn smooth where his palms gripped it day after day, year after year, and he moved through the building like a ghost who'd learned to love his own haunting. The water in the bucket was already grey by 10 in the morning, swirling with the residue of childhood, mud from recess, juice spills, the scattered glitter from art class that never quite disappeared no matter how hard he tried. Mark had been trying for 7 years now, trying to clean away the evidence of a life he could only watch from the margins, trying to make himself useful in the only way the world would allow. The morning light came through the tall windows near the main entrance, casting geometric shadows across the checkerboard tile that Mark had buffed to a shine before dawn. He'd been awake since 4:30, the way he always was, unable to sleep through the hours when he knew she'd be arriving soon. Lily Hart, 7 years old, 4th of November birthday, loved strawberry milk, but only if it came in the small cartons with the bendy straws. Afraid of the hand dryer in the girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor. Drew hearts on every piece of homework, even when the assignment had nothing to do with love. Mark knew these things the way other fathers knew them, through observation, through the patient archaeology of parenthood, but he knew them from a distance that felt like drowning in slow motion. He positioned himself near the trophy case outside the main office, pretending to polish brass plaques that were already gleaming, and he waited. The yellow school buses groaned to a stop outside, their brakes hissing, their doors folding open to release streams of children into the October morning that smelled like wet leaves and the beginning of something Mark couldn't name. She came through the double doors at 7:48, the same time every day. But this morning she wasn't walking, she was skipping. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders. Covered in patches she'd begged someone to iron on, a rainbow, a smiling sun, a unicorn that had started to peel at the edges. Her hair was pulled into 2 ponytails that swung as she moved, dark brown like his, with the same slight wave that never quite straightened no matter what product you used. Mark's chest tightened, the way it always did when he saw her. A physical ache that started behind his sternum and spread outward until his fingers tingled and his vision blurred at the edges. She wore light-up sneakers that flashed pink with every step, and jeans with a small tear at the knee, and a purple jacket that was too thin for the weather but probably cost more than Mark made in a month. He watched her stop at the water fountain, watched her rise up on her toes to reach the button, watched the way she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand afterward, like she was in a hurry to get somewhere important. The golden car pulled up exactly 3 minutes after the buses, as it did every morning, a sleek German machine that cost more than Mark would earn in 5 years of mopping floors. It idled at the curb, with the engine purring so quietly you could barely hear it, and the driver, a man Mark had never learned the name of, sat behind the wheel checking his phone, while Grant Hart emerged from the back seat like a man ascending from a throne. 48 years old, silver-grey hair, styled with the kind of precision that required appointments and products Mark couldn't pronounce. Wearing a suit that probably had a name brand Mark wouldn't recognize, even if he saw the label. Grant Hart moved through the world with the certainty of someone who'd never been told he didn't belong anywhere. Someone who'd never had to ask permission or apologize for taking up space. He didn't enter the school. He never did. He stood by the car door, checking his watch, waiting for something or someone that apparently existed on his schedule, and then he was gone, sliding back into the leather interior while the driver pulled away from the curb so smoothly it looked like the car was floating. Mark squeezed the mop handle until his knuckles went white, watching the golden car disappear around the corner of Maple Street, watching it vanish into the world where Grant Hart lived, a world of boardrooms and country clubs and decisions made over lunches that cost more than Mark's weekly grocery budget. The contrast was so sharp it felt like violence, like someone had taken a knife and carved a line down the center of reality and said, "This side for you, that side for him, and never shall the two meet." Mark's world smelled like bleach and industrial soap, and the faint, sour smell of milk gone bad in forgotten lockers. It sounded like the squeak of his cartwheels and the buzz of fluorescent lights and the echo of his own breathing in empty hallways. It tasted like the cheap coffee he made in the janitor's closet and the generic peanut butter sandwiches he ate, standing up during his 15-minute lunch break. Grant Hart's world was invisible to Mark, except in glimpses like this, moments when the golden car appeared and reminded him that there were universes beyond his reach, castles built on money and status, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to wonder if you mattered. Inside his pocket, folded into a square so small it could hide in his palm, was the envelope Mark had received 7 years ago from a laboratory in Columbus. He'd paid for the test with 3 weeks' worth of overtime, working doubles and weekends, mopping the high school gymnasium after basketball games, and scrubbing the teacher's lounge until the grout between the tiles looked new again. The envelope had arrived in his mailbox on a Tuesday in November, thin and official, and he'd opened it alone in his apartment with hands that shook so badly he'd nearly torn the paper. The results were there in black and white. Percentages and genetic markers, and a conclusion that left no room for interpretation. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. He was her father. Not the man in the golden car, not the billionaire with the perfect hair and the watch that cost more than Mark's annual salary. Him, the janitor, the invisible man with the mop bucket and the third-shift solitude. Mark had folded the paper back into the envelope and put it in his pocket, and it had lived there ever since, pressed against his hip like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud, but too precious to throw away. Mark's apartment was 12 minutes from the school if he drove the speed limit, 14 if he hit the red light at Patterson Avenue, which he always did because the universe seemed to enjoy these small cruelties. The building was a squat brick structure from the 1970s that smelled like fried onions and old carpet, divided into units too small for families, but too expensive for what they offered. He lived in 3B. A one-bedroom with a kitchenette and a bathroom, where the shower pressure fluctuated between trickle and assault, depending on whether the neighbors were home. The walls were thin enough that he could hear Mrs. Chen upstairs arguing with her daughter about college applications, and Mr. Rodriguez next door playing the same mariachi album every Sunday morning while he cooked breakfast. Mark didn't mind the noise. It reminded him he wasn't completely alone, even if most days he felt like he was living on the far side of a glass wall, where he could see humanity but never quite touch it. The evening after he'd received the DNA results, Mark had sat at his kitchen table with the envelope in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. The overhead light hummed and flickered, casting uneven shadows across the paper, and outside his window the October darkness pressed against the glass like something waiting to be let in. He'd read the document 3 times, tracing the words with his finger, trying to make sense of what they meant in practical terms. Biology didn't change anything about Lily's life. She still lived in the Hart mansion on Riverside Drive, still attended the private piano lessons and the art classes, and the summer camps that Mark had only heard about through overheard conversations in the school hallways. She still called Grant Hart Daddy, in her small voice that carried down corridors and pierced Mark's chest every single time. The DNA in her cells might match Mark's, might prove that his blood ran in her veins, but it couldn't compete with the reality of Grant Hart's money and status and the legal documents that said she belonged to him. Mark had spent 7 years working at Dayton Elementary, and in that time he'd become invisible in the way that service workers do, present but not seen, necessary but not acknowledged. Teachers walked past him in the hallways without making eye contact. Parents stepped around his mop bucket without breaking stride. Children sometimes waved or said thank you when he held doors open for them, but mostly they looked through him as if he were part of the building's infrastructure, no more worthy of attention than the water fountains or the exit signs. He'd learned to move quietly, to keep his head down, to do his job without expecting recognition or gratitude. The invisibility had become comfortable in a strange way, a protective coating that let him observe without being observed, that let him stay close to Lily without raising questions about why the janitor seemed so interested in one particular child. He cleaned the classroom where she learned to read. He mopped the cafeteria where she ate lunch with her friends. He emptied the trash cans in the music room where she practiced for the school play. He was always there, always within sight of her, and no one ever wondered why. The envelope stayed in his pocket through every shift, growing soft at the edges from constant handling, the ink fading slightly where his thumb rubbed across her name. Sometimes during his lunch break, he'd sit on the loading dock behind the school, eating his sandwich and staring at the envelope without opening it, as if the proof needed to be real in his hands, even though he'd already memorized every word. The paper had become a kind of talisman, evidence that he wasn't crazy or delusional or inventing a connection that didn't exist. She was his daughter. The science said so, the genetics didn't lie. But science couldn't change the fact that he was nobody in the eyes of the world, a man whose worth was measured in how well he cleaned toilets and how quietly he pushed his cart through hallways where more important people conducted more important business. The envelope proved paternity, but it couldn't prove value, couldn't make him into the kind of father a child deserved, couldn't transform him into someone Grant Hart's lawyers wouldn't crush like an insect under a very expensive shoe. Mark had researched what it would take to challenge custody, spending hours at the public library after his shifts, using the computers in the back corner where no one would ask what he was looking for. The legal requirements were staggering. He'd need a lawyer, which meant money he didn't have. He'd need to prove that Grant Hart was an unfit parent, which seemed impossible when the man could hire the best attorneys and character witnesses money could buy. He'd need to expose the truth about Lily's parentage, which would destroy whatever stability she had, would rip her world apart, and force her to choose between the father who raised her and the father who shared her DNA. The more Mark learned, the more hopeless it seemed. Family court favored stability over biology, favored the parent with resources over the parent with love, favored the life a child already knew over the life a child might have with a struggling janitor in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled like other people's dinners. Mark had closed the browser windows and walked out of the library into the November cold feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach, feeling like the truth was a weapon he could never afford to use, so he'd kept silent. He'd folded the envelope back into his pocket and returned to work and continued his careful observation from the margins of Lily's life. He'd watched her lose her first tooth in the school bathroom, and he'd been the one to find it on the floor, and place it in a tissue for her to take home. He'd seen her fall on the playground and scrape her knee, and he'd brought her a bandage from the first aid kit in his closet, kneeling beside her while she sniffled and said, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded so much like his own mother's voice, it made his throat close up. He'd been there for her school picture day, for her science fair project, for the day she won the spelling bee and jumped up and down with excitement while her teacher applauded. He'd been there for all of it, invisible but present, silent but attentive, loving her from a distance that felt like torture but was the only distance the world would allow. The envelope stayed in his pocket like a heartbeat, constant and hidden, proof of a truth that could never be spoken aloud without destroying everything. The school play had been the only thing anyone could talk about for 3 weeks. Posters covered every available surface in the hallways, construction paper decorated with stars and moons, and the title written in glitter glue that shed sparkles onto the floor like tiny pieces of trapped light. A Midsummer Night's Dream, the children's edition. Lily had come home with her script in mid-September, clutching it against her chest like it was made of gold, and Mark had overheard her telling her friend Emma that she was going to be a fairy in the forest scene. She'd practiced her lines in the cafeteria during lunch, whispering them to herself while she picked at her sandwich, and Mark had memorized them too, just from hearing them repeated over and over. "Through the forest have I gone, but Athenian found I none." She always stumbled on Athenian, pronouncing it with too many syllables, and Mark wanted desperately to help her, but he couldn't, because janitors didn't give acting coaching to children who weren't theirs to coach. The week before the performance, the school transformed into organized chaos. Teachers herded students through hallway rehearsals. Parent volunteers arrived with bags full of fabric and hot glue guns to finish costumes in the art room. The drama teacher, Mrs. Brennan, walked around with a clipboard and an expression of barely controlled panic, calling out instructions about blocking and projection and staying in character even during scene changes. Mark worked overtime that week, coming in early and staying late to accommodate all the extra activity. He mopped around dress rehearsals. He emptied trash cans overflowing with discarded costume pieces and snack wrappers. He fixed a broken lock on the auditorium door. He replaced burned-out bulbs in the stage lights. He did everything he could to make himself useful, to be present, to remain close to the production that had consumed Lily's attention and energy for weeks. She walked past him twice, carrying her fairy wings, the wireframes wrapped in sheer purple fabric that caught the light when she moved. And both times she smiled at him with that gap-toothed grin that made his heart stop and restart in a different rhythm. The night of the performance arrived cold and clear, the kind of October evening where the air smelled like wood smoke and the stars looked close enough to touch. Mark finished his shift at 5:30, cleaning the teacher's lounge and restocking paper towels in all the bathrooms, but he didn't leave. He couldn't leave. He changed out of his work uniform in the janitor's closet, pulling on the only decent clothes he owned. Khaki pants he'd bought at Goodwill, and a button-down shirt that was slightly too big in the shoulders. He'd ironed them the night before, standing at his kitchen counter with the ironing board set up in front of the television, trying to get the creases sharp and professional, even though he knew he'd never look like the other parents who'd be filling the auditorium. He combed his hair in the small mirror above the utility sink. He washed the smell of bleach off his hands as best he could. He folded the DNA envelope and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart, where it rested like a secret or a prayer or evidence of something too complicated to name. The auditorium was already filling up when Mark approached the main entrance at 6:15. Families streamed through the double doors, parents holding programs and flowers, younger siblings running ahead toward the rows of fold-down seats that faced the stage. The overhead lights were bright and warm, and the air smelled like perfume and hairspray, and the nervous excitement that always preceded school performances. Mark had never entered through this door before. He'd only ever been in the auditorium through the backstage entrance or the loading dock, coming in to fix something or clean something or move something that needed moving. Walking through the main entrance felt like trespassing, like crossing an invisible line that separated his world from theirs. He stood in the doorway for a moment, holding his breath, watching the crowd find their seats and greet each other with handshakes and hugs and the easy familiarity of people who belong to the same social universe. Then someone touched his arm. A woman in a burgundy blazer with a name tag that said Volunteer Coordinator looked at him with polite confusion, her smile professional but strained. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of careful courtesy people used when they were about to ask you to leave. "Are you here for the performance?" Mark nodded, not trusting his voice yet. "Yes," he managed. "I'm here to watch." The woman's smile flickered. "Are you a family member of one of the performers?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Mark's throat tightened. He wanted to show her the envelope in his pocket, wanted to unfold it right there in the doorway and prove that he had every right to be here, that his DNA was woven into one of the children on that stage, that biology gave him more claim to a seat in this auditorium than half the people already sitting down. But he didn't. He couldn't. "I work here," he said instead, his voice quieter than he intended. "I'm the janitor. I've been helping with the production." The woman's expression shifted, sympathy and discomfort mixing in her eyes. "I understand," she said, "but the performance is for family and invited guests only. If you're not on the list, I'm afraid we can't let you in." Behind her, Mark could see the stage curtains drawn closed, could see the edge of the painted forest backdrop that students had worked on for weeks. He could hear voices from backstage, children laughing nervously, Mrs. Brennan's voice calling out last-minute reminders. Somewhere in that chaos was Lily, wearing her fairy wings, practicing her lines one more time, her small hands probably trembling the way they always did when she was nervous. Mark started, then stopped. "She's my daughter." The words were right there on his tongue, ready to be spoken, but he swallowed them back down. "I just wanted to see her perform," he said finally. "Just wanted to be here." The volunteer coordinator's face softened, but her stance didn't change. "I'm sorry," she said, and she might have actually meant it. "Policy is policy. You'll have to leave." Mark turned away from the auditorium doors, his vision blurring at the edges, his chest tight with humiliation and grief that tasted like copper in his mouth. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and fluorescent bright, every surface reflecting his defeat back at him in shades of institutional beige and grey. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum he'd mopped 1,000 times, the sound hollow and final, like the closing of a door he'd never be able to open again. Behind him, he could hear the auditorium filling up, hear the murmur of conversation and laughter, hear the rustle of programs and the scrape of chairs as families settled in to watch their children perform. The sounds were warm and alive, and they belonged to a world he couldn't enter, a world where fathers had the right to watch their daughters without being questioned or turned away, or made to feel like criminals for wanting to be present. He walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, past the trophy case where he'd polished brass plaques that morning, past the main office where the secretary had wished him good evening hours ago, past the water fountain where Lily stopped every morning on her way to class. The building felt different at night, emptier, but also more full, haunted by the accumulated energy of all the children who'd passed through these hallways over the years. Mark had cleaned here long enough to know the school's rhythms, its moods, the way certain corners always smelled like paste from the kindergarten wing, and the way the second-floor bathroom tiles never quite came clean, no matter how much elbow grease he applied. He knew this place better than he knew his own apartment, had spent more waking hours here than anywhere else, and yet he was being expelled from it like a trespasser, like someone who didn't belong, like someone whose love didn't count because it wasn't backed up by legal documents or social status or a golden car parked at the curb. The DNA envelope pressed against his chest through the thin fabric of his shirt, a small square of paper that weighed more than anything else he carried. Mark stopped walking halfway down the corridor. Standing beneath a bulletin board covered in student artwork, crayon drawings of families, houses with chimneys, stick figures holding hands under yellow suns. One of the drawings was Lily's. He recognized her signature in the bottom corner, her name written in careful block letters with a heart dotting the I. The picture showed three figures, a small girl in a purple dress, a tall woman with yellow hair, and an even taller man in a blue suit. "My family" was written across the top in red marker. Mark stared at the drawing, his hands trembling, seeing himself erased from the picture the way he'd been erased from her life. Reduced to a ghost who cleaned the building where she learned and played and grew into someone who would never know he existed as anything more than the quiet man with the mop bucket. From somewhere far away, muffled by walls and distance, he heard the auditorium erupt in applause. The show had started. The curtain must have opened. The lights must have come up on the painted forest and the children in their costumes, and somewhere in that crowd of performers was Lily, wearing her fairy wings and speaking her lines in her small, brave voice. Mark pressed his palm against the wall to steady himself, felt the cold painted concrete under his skin, felt his heart hammering against his ribs like it wanted to break free and go where his body couldn't. 7 years. 7 years of swallowing his truth, of accepting his place at the margins, of convincing himself that loving her from a distance was enough, because it had to be enough. 7 years of watching Grant Hart ignore her in the mornings, of seeing the golden car arrive and depart without the man inside ever stepping through the school doors, of knowing that the father who claimed her never attended her events or knew her teachers' names or understood that she was afraid of hand dryers and loved strawberry milk. But Mark couldn't go back. He couldn't fight past the volunteer coordinator and force his way into a seat he wasn't entitled to. He couldn't make a scene and risk having security called, risk having Lily find out about it later and wonder why the janitor was acting so strangely. He couldn't do anything except stand in this empty hallway and feel the weight of his powerlessness pressing down on his shoulders like gravity had suddenly increased. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant song above his head. The building settled around him with small creaks and sighs. Outside the windows, darkness had fallen completely, and Mark could see his own reflection in the glass, a middle-aged man in clothes that didn't fit quite right. A man who looked tired and defeated and smaller than he'd been that morning when he'd pushed his cart through these same hallways, with hope still flickering somewhere in his chest. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the empty corridor or the distant applause or the hum of lights overhead. A door opening somewhere behind him. Fast footsteps, small footsteps, running. Mark turned slowly, his body moving before his mind could catch up, and there at the far end of the hallway was Lily, still wearing her fairy wings, still in her costume with glitter on her cheeks and her hair falling out of its careful arrangement. She was running toward him with her arms outstretched and her face streaked with tears, and her mouth was open, and she was calling out a single word that shattered every carefully maintained boundary Mark had built around himself for 7 years. "Daddy," she sobbed, her voice echoing down the corridor, bouncing off the walls and the trophy cases and the bulletin boards covered in other children's drawings. "Daddy, don't go!" Lily crashed into Mark's legs with the force of a small hurricane, her arms wrapping around his knees, her face pressed against his khaki pants, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed too large for someone so small. Mark stood frozen, his hands hovering in the air above her head, afraid to touch her, afraid not to touch her, afraid that if he moved at all, he'd wake up from whatever impossible dream this was and find himself back in his apartment, staring at his kitchen ceiling at 4 a.m. The fairy wings on her back were slightly crushed from running, the purple fabric bent at odd angles, and there was a smudge of stage makeup on her cheek that made her look younger and older at the same time. "Don't leave!" she gasped between sobs, her voice muffled against his leg. "Please don't leave me!" Mark's throat closed completely. His hands finally came down, trembling, resting gently on the top of her head, feeling the warmth of her scalp through her hair, feeling the realness of her beneath his palms. Behind Lily, the hallway exploded into motion. Mrs. Brennan appeared first, still holding her clipboard, her face flushed and panicked. "Lily!" she shouted, running after the child who'd apparently bolted from backstage in the middle of the performance. "Lily Hart, you need to come back right now." 2 more teachers followed, and then parents who'd heard the commotion, and then finally the volunteer coordinator in her burgundy blazer, looking horrified at the scene unfolding in the corridor she'd just cleared. The crowd formed a semicircle around Mark and Lily, watching with expressions ranging from confusion to concern to poorly disguised judgment. Mark could feel their stares like physical weight, could sense the questions forming in their minds. Why was the janitor holding this child? Why was she calling him Daddy? What exactly was happening here that violated every social norm and expectation about proper boundaries between school staff and students? "Someone call her father," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice sharp with authority and barely controlled chaos. "Someone call Grant Hart right now." One of the parents pulled out a phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen. Mark could hear the ringtone from where he stood, a classical piece he didn't recognize, and then a voice answering with professional irritation. This had better be important. The parent explained the situation in clipped sentences. "Your daughter left the stage. She's in the hallway. There's some kind of situation with the janitor." Mark felt Lily's grip tighten on his legs. "He smells like my blanket," she mumbled into his pants, her voice thick with tears. "He's the one who's always here." The words stabbed through Mark's chest like shrapnel, each syllable a small explosion of recognition and pain, and something that felt dangerously close to joy. Grant Hart arrived 12 minutes later, and Mark knew it was exactly 12 minutes because he counted every second, feeling each one tick past, while Lily clung to him, and the crowd of teachers and parents whispered among themselves, and Mrs. Brennan tried unsuccessfully to coax the child back to the auditorium. When the doors at the end of the hallway banged open, Grant Hart strode through them with the energy of a man accustomed to solving problems through force of personality and checkbook. He was still wearing his suit from whatever business dinner or board meeting he'd been attending, his tie loosened slightly, his hair perfect despite the fact that he'd apparently driven from wherever he was, at dangerous speeds. His face was a careful mask of concern, underwritten with fury, the expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had just been challenged by a 7-year-old's emotional outburst in a public school hallway. "Lily," Grant said, his voice commanding immediate attention, the kind of voice that brooked no argument or resistance. "Come here, now." But Lily didn't move. She pressed herself harder against Mark's legs, her small fingers digging into the fabric of his pants, her breathing quick and shallow. "No," she said, the word tiny but absolute. Grant's mask slipped for just a second, revealing something raw underneath. Embarrassment, anger, fear. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum, and he extended his hand toward his daughter with the expectation that she would obey without question. "Lily Hart, I'm not going to ask again." Mark felt something shift in his chest, felt 7 years of silence and submission and careful invisibility crack open like an egg breaking from the inside. His hand moved from the top of Lily's head to her shoulder, a protective gesture so instinctive he didn't realize he'd done it until it was done. Grant's eyes snapped to Mark's face, really seeing him for probably the first time ever, and in that look Mark saw calculation and dismissal and a very particular kind of rage reserved for people who dared to challenge the natural order of things. "Who are you?" Grant asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and found it beneath his attention. "I'm the janitor," Mark said, and his voice was steadier than he expected, carrying down the hallway with more force than he'd ever allowed himself to use in this building. "But I'm also her father." The hallway went completely silent. The crowd of parents and teachers seemed to stop breathing. Even Lily looked up, her tear-streaked face turning toward Mark with an expression of confusion and hope and recognition all tangled together. Grant Hart's face went through several colors in rapid succession, red, white, purple, before settling on a kind of frozen fury that made his jaw muscles jump. "You're fired," he said, the words sharp and final, "and you'll be hearing from my lawyers before the night is over." Mark felt the DNA envelope pressing against his heart, felt the truth it contained pushing against his ribs, demanding to be spoken. "Then they can contact my lawyers too," he said, even though he didn't have lawyers and couldn't afford lawyers and knew this was probably professional suicide. "Because she's mine, and I have proof." The hallway had become a courtroom without a judge, a theater without a script, a battlefield where the weapons were words and the casualties were certainties. Mark reached into his shirt pocket with his free hand, the other still resting on Lily's shoulder, feeling her small frame trembling beneath his palm, and pulled out the envelope that had lived there for 7 years. The paper was soft from handling, the edges rounded, the fold lines threatening to tear from being opened and closed so many times in private moments when Mark needed to remind himself he wasn't inventing this connection. He held it up in the fluorescent light, and the gesture felt both enormous and pathetically small, like he was trying to hold back an ocean with a piece of paper no bigger than his hand. "DNA test," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the second word. 99.9% probability of paternity. I've known since she was born. I've been here every single day since then." Grant Hart's expression shifted through several iterations of disbelief before settling on something colder and more calculating. "That's impossible," he said. But there was a thread of uncertainty in his voice now, a crack in the foundation of his certainty. "We have birth certificates, legal documents, a marriage—" He stopped abruptly, and in that pause Mark could see him doing the math, counting backward, remembering timelines he'd probably tried to forget. 7 years ago, Grant Hart had been married to Rachel Emerson, Lily's mother, though the marriage had been troubled even then, according to the rumors Mark had heard through the thin walls of workplace gossip. Rachel had worked at one of Grant's hotels downtown, managing the events department, and there had been whispers about separations and reconciliations and the kind of dysfunction that money couldn't fix, no matter how much of it you threw at the problem. She'd passed away when Lily was 3, a car accident on a rainy night that Mark had learned about through the obituary in the Dayton Daily News. "Rachel and I," Mark started, then had to stop and swallow against the thickness in his throat. "We knew each other before you married her, before she even met you." The crowd pressed closer, and Mark could feel their attention like heat against his skin, could sense phones being pulled out to record this moment for later dissection on social media and in group texts and at dinner tables across Dayton. He didn't care anymore. The silence had become unbearable, heavier than the truth could ever be, and if speaking was going to destroy him, then at least the destruction would be honest. "We were together for 6 months. Then you came along with your money and your promises and your whole empire, and she made a choice I understood, even if it hurt." Lily's grip on his leg loosened slightly. Mark could feel her turning to look up at him, could sense her small mind working through information that was too complex for a 7-year-old, but somehow still comprehensible on an instinctive level. "She told me about the pregnancy before she told you," Mark continued, the words coming faster now, 7 years of stored sentences finally finding their way out. "She said she was going to pass the baby off as yours because I had nothing to offer, no money, no stability, no future that looked anything like the life she wanted for her child. I didn't argue. I was 28 years old, making minimum wage and living in a place that barely qualified as an apartment. She was right about everything except one thing." He looked down at Lily, whose face was still streaked with tears and stage makeup and something that looked like dawning understanding. She thought biology didn't matter as much as security. But biology is the only thing I've had to hold on to for 7 years. His voice broke completely on the last word, dissolving into something raw and wounded. "The only thing that's kept me sane was knowing she was mine, even when everyone treated me like I was nothing." Grant Hart's face had gone from purple to grey, the colour of someone who'd just realised the ground beneath his feet was significantly less stable than he'd believed. "Rachel never mentioned," he started, then stopped, his corporate composure fracturing in real time. "She never said anything about another man." Mark felt something bitter rise in his throat, tasting like all the years of watching Grant ignore Lily's events, miss her parent-teacher conferences, send his driver instead of coming himself. "Would it have mattered?" he asked, and the question hung in the air like an accusation. "Would you have loved her less? Or would you have just found a better lawyer?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Brennan looked torn between professional obligation and human sympathy. The volunteer coordinator had her hand over her mouth. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled sounds of the school play continued, children singing, parents applauding, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the hallway. "I want a new test," Grant said finally, his voice tight with control that was barely holding. "We'll do it properly, with lawyers present, with a court-approved laboratory." Mark nodded slowly, expecting this, understanding that Grant Hart didn't become a billionaire by taking anyone at their word. "Fine," he said. "Test us both. Test her. But you already know what it's going to say." He looked down at Lily again, at her dark hair that matched his, at the shape of her eyes that were his mother's eyes, looking back at him across 3 generations, at the way she held her mouth when she was thinking that was identical to his own unconscious habit. "Look at her," Mark said softly. "Really look at her. How long have you been pretending not to see it?" Grant's jaw worked silently, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. For a moment, Mark thought the man might actually swing at him, might let the rage overflow into physical violence. But instead, Grant just stood there, breathing heavily through his nose like a bull, considering whether to charge. Then Lily spoke, her voice small, but surprisingly clear in the shocked silence. "I knew," she said, and every adult in the hallway turned to stare at her. "I knew he was different. He's the only one who comes to everything." Her small hand found Mark's, her fingers wrapping around his pinky and ring finger, and the gesture was so trusting and simple that Mark felt his knees threaten to buckle. "You never come," she said to Grant, her voice not accusing, but stating a fact as observable as the color of the sky. "Not to my plays or my art shows or my spelling bee, but he's always here. He fixes things. He helped me when I fell. He smiles at me like—" She paused, searching for words she didn't quite have yet. "Like I'm the most important thing." Grant Hart's carefully constructed mask finally shattered completely, his face crumpling into something that looked almost human, almost vulnerable, almost capable of understanding what he'd lost while he was busy building empires and making money and treating fatherhood like another item on a schedule to be managed by assistants. The administrative office at Dayton Elementary School was not designed for the kind of meeting that took place 3 days after the hallway confrontation. Principal Morrison had cleared her schedule and brought in the district superintendent, and Grant Hart had arrived with 2 lawyers, whose suits probably cost more than the entire office furniture budget. Mark sat across from them, wearing the same Goodwill khakis and button-down shirt. No lawyer, no representation, except the DNA envelope and the truth it contained. Between them, in a chair that was slightly too big for her, sat Lily, who'd insisted on being present despite multiple adults trying to convince her to wait outside. "It's about me," she'd said with a 7-year-old's absolute logic. "I should be here." Nobody had found an argument strong enough to counter that. The second DNA test had been conducted at a hospital in Columbus under the supervision of court-appointed officials. Cheek swabs taken from all 3 of them in a room that smelled like antiseptic, and the nervous sweat of people whose lives were about to change irrevocably. The results had come back identical to Mark's original test. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Grant Hart had read the document 3 times, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name, before finally setting it down on the conference table and staring at it like it was written in a language he'd never learned to read. Mark had expected rage or denial or threats of legal action, but instead Grant just looked tired, hollowed out, a man who'd built his identity on control and certainty, suddenly discovering that the most important relationship in his life had been built on a foundation of sand. "I want to be clear," Grant said finally, his voice lacking its usual command, sounding almost normal for the first time since Mark had known him. "I've loved her as my daughter for 7 years. The DNA doesn't change that." Mark nodded, understanding this in a way he hadn't expected to. "I know," he said quietly. "You raised her. You gave her everything I couldn't." The admission hurt to say aloud, but it was true, and Mark had spent enough years living with painful truths to know that speaking them was usually better than swallowing them. "But I've been here too, every day, watching her grow up from behind my mop bucket, because that was the only way I could be part of her life." Grant's lawyers shifted uncomfortably, their expensive training probably not covering situations where biology and fatherhood diverged this messily. Principal Morrison looked between the 2 men with an expression of profound sympathy, understanding that there were no winners in this situation, only different kinds of loss. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours, voices rising and falling, legal terminology mixing with raw emotion, until eventually they arrived at something that resembled a framework, if not quite an agreement. Joint custody, though the specifics would need to be worked out with family court involvement. Lily would continue living primarily with Grant in the Riverside mansion because stability mattered, and her school was nearby, and Mark's 1-bedroom apartment wasn't suitable for a child according to every reasonable standard. But Mark would get weekends. He'd get holidays. He'd get to be present at her events without being treated like a trespasser or a janitor who'd overstepped his boundaries. He'd get to be acknowledged as her father publicly, legally, permanently. The lawyers drafted preliminary documents. Principal Morrison promised to update Lily's school records. The superintendent looked vaguely traumatized by the whole situation, but agreed to allow Mark to continue working at the school with the understanding that his relationship with Lily would need to be transparent and appropriate. Through all of this, Lily sat quietly, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor, watching the adults negotiate her future with an expression that was part bewilderment and part resignation. When they finally asked her what she wanted, a question that came too late, but at least it came, she looked at Mark with eyes that were his eyes, looking back at him, and said, "I want both." Her voice was small but certain. "I want my daddy who takes me to piano lessons and buys me things." She turned to Grant, and her expression softened with something like affection or habit, or the love that grows from proximity and routine. "But I also want my daddy, who's always here, who smells like my blanket, who looks at me like I matter more than anything." Grant's face crumpled slightly. Mark's throat closed. Both men nodded, understanding that they'd been given an assignment by someone much wiser than either of them, despite being 7 years old and barely tall enough to reach the water fountain without standing on her toes. The school year continued. Mark kept his job, though he moved to day shift so he could be more visible, less like a ghost haunting the hallways and more like a father who happened to work in the building where his daughter learned and grew. Grant started attending Lily's events, showing up in his golden car, but actually getting out and walking through the doors and sitting in the audience with the other parents. The two men learned to exist in the same spaces without either violence or friendship, united by their love for a child who belonged to both of them in different ways. Sometimes Mark would see Grant watching Lily with an expression of confused grief, as if he was mourning the uncomplicated fatherhood he'd thought he had, while simultaneously trying to understand this new, complicated version. Sometimes Grant would catch Mark staring at Lily with that same expression of wonder he'd worn since she was born, and something that looked almost like respect would flicker across the billionaire's face. On the day of the winter concert 3 months later, Mark sat in the auditorium next to Grant Hart, both of them watching Lily sing carols with her class on a stage decorated with paper snowflakes and strings of electric lights. Their shoulders almost touched in the crowded seating. Neither man moved away. When Lily sang her solo, a single verse of Silent Night that she performed with her eyes closed and her hands clasped in front of her, Mark felt tears running down his face that he didn't bother to hide. Grant pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at his own eyes with the kind of discretion that suggested he'd had a lot of practice hiding emotion in public. When the song ended and the audience applauded, Lily opened her eyes and looked directly at both of them, sitting side by side in the third row, and her smile was bright enough to light the whole auditorium. She waved with both hands, fingers spread wide, and Mark waved back with his right hand, while Grant waved with his left. And in that synchronized gesture was something that looked almost like peace, or at least the beginning of it. The DNA envelope stayed in Mark's pocket, softer than ever, nearly transparent at the folds, but he didn't need to look at it anymore. The truth it contained had been spoken and acknowledged and integrated into the world where it belonged. Lily knew now. Everyone knew. Mark was no longer invisible, no longer the janitor who loved from the shadows, no longer the father who existed only in biology and secret hope. He was present, he was seen, he was allowed to love his daughter openly and claim her as his own and be claimed by her in return. The cost had been high, his privacy, his simplicity, his comfortable invisibility, but the alternative had been unbearable. 7 years of silence had nearly destroyed him. Speaking the truth had wounded everyone involved, but it had also freed them, opened space for a kind of honesty that was messy and uncomfortable and real in ways that the previous arrangement had never been. Mark still mopped floors. He still emptied trash cans and fixed broken fixtures and worked in the margins of other people's lives. But now, when Lily ran down the hallway shouting, "Daddy!" she meant him, openly and without confusion, and that single word made everything, the humiliation, the confrontation, the shattered silence, worth every painful second.